Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined once again by Stephen Erikson. Hello, Steve.
Hi. I'm probably appearing way too much on YouTube these days. But anyways, here we are.
But, well, okay. We're overindulging in Erikson. But
Yeah, I guess.
the reason we are having this chat is because obviously we've been having a discussion about aspects of writing. And we talked about narrative point of view, first, second, or third person perspective. We talked about dialogue. And one of the things, obviously, that comes up then is exposition, the other major aspect of writing that we find in fiction.
The only other major aspect, I mean, it's dialogue or exposition. I can't think of anything else.
Poetry, epigraph.
That's, yeah, no. We're talking about in fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, yes,
Um,
you can throw poetry in, but sure. But you
and
separate it out from the rest of the text anyways.
yeah,
So,
and song lyrics or
yeah.
poetic lyrics that are added
Yeah.
in as part of a scene. But the major aspect is uh, exposition or dialogue. Those are the
Yeah.
the two major things. And if we were making a comparison to say drama is almost all dialogue,
And
and
stage direction. Yeah.
the stage direction is sort of like the secret games master notes that only the games master can see that helps shape the action. So it has a corresponding function to exposition,
Yeah.
but it's not available to the consumer of the narrative,
Yeah.
except in how it has been executed.
Yeah, same in film script and television scripts. Yeah.
And then if we think of even epic or narrative poems, uh, the exposition is worked in verse form. So you would expect different rules applying to it because verse poetry has its own entire framework that you are working within or arguing against. So we are specifically looking at exposition in fiction writing, and even then, it's the general principles because there's always going to be exceptions where authors, the way that you like to do,
Mm.
break the rules.
Yeah. But then you look at something like exposition in comic books and graphic novels, which is kind of interesting because that is placing a narrative within a visual medium. And so it ends up kind of taking the best of both worlds and putting them in one place. But anyways, I mean, before we get into any of that stuff, we were having an earlier discussion about uh, these workshops, these discussions about narrative structure, and the fact that we're offering them for free. And by virtue of offering them for free, they may be less valued. To which I responded, I didn't care. It doesn't matter to me at all. I'm more interested in whether it's two or three people out there who get something of value from this and can apply it to themselves as beginning writers, and presumably from your point of view, in terms of analysis of fiction. And to me, those things are valuable in and of themselves.
And they are. And when we were talking about this, my perspective is I want education to be free, to be accessible
Mm.
to everyone. And that would be my ideological position. And I have a YouTube channel and I do talks and videos about various aspects of narrative, and I offer it for free. But the problem is we operate in a very capitalist culture, and because of that, because it's free, it's quite often either dismissed
Hmm.
or people don't pay attention to it. It's kind of half listened to. And I think if we put this behind a paywall, if we had done all of our discussions and hid them behind a paywall, A, the people who were paying for it would probably pay more attention to it because this is something they paid for. B, they would value it more because it cost them something. And therefore, the likelihood of the aspects of things that we talk about having a greater impact would actually be increased. And yet I am ideologically opposed
Yeah, and
putting education behind a paywall.
yeah, and I can't tell you how many times in response um, to say essays I put onto my Facebook page, or and those kinds of things, where a fan will comment like something to the effect of, if you turn this into a course, I'd pay for it. And I tend not to respond to that, because you don't have to pay for it. It's right here in front of you, right? I'm delivering it. Take it for what it's worth. And of course, that's the issue, is that in a capitalist society, the notion of worth is attached to a monetary value. But I don't think either of us play by those rules. And that's just how it is.
And probably to our financial detriment. But
Sure.
neither one of us is doing this because, oh, this is money-making scheme number 73. Like, we have these conversations because A, we are passionate about this nerdy stuff.
Mm.
We love it. And B, it is helpful either as a beginning writer, like the perspective that you talk about it from, the position of someone in the craft. But I also think there's an enormous value as a reader of understanding what these things are, how they operate, because it helps us as readers become more adept. It exposes us to different techniques. Instead of our palette being formed by the three different tastes of this is literature, it's suddenly a kaleidoscope of different techniques. We go, oh, actually, that one's really interesting. And it adds to our appreciation of the craft of writing, which for me, in the works that I love, adds to my depth of appreciation, understanding, and love of them, because I understand more about what went into it. It wasn't just that it entertained me or enthralled me or captivated me, but I could then appreciate the artistry that went into creating that effect, and understanding how an author manipulated me, and going, almost creating that sense of awe of how an author does things. And I
Right.
love that
Right.
aspect.
And that's where from very early on, my obsession with craft basically began in a classroom, a creative writing classroom here in Victoria. And it stayed with me ever since, because what I asked myself, and by looking at other writers, this is what I went looking for, was how do you convey the emotions that you want to get across? How do you guide the reader to the place where you want them to end up? And it all boiled down to language. And that's where my obsession sort of begins, and in many ways ends. It's all about language. And so if we're talking exposition, that is where it all starts in terms of language, because there's a narrative stance that the writer then takes with that first line of exposition. That stance has begun to reveal itself. And then, as the writer, quite often you'll proceed and provide your first paragraph, your second paragraph, and all the rest, at least for myself. And then I stop and I look back on what I wrote to find the narrative stance that I instinctively started with. And for me, and I would recommend this to any beginning writer, is that to trust your instincts, and to make that beginning, but then to pause and look and deconstruct what you just did to understand where it's coming from, because that is the ammunition you can then use to basically fill out the rest of the narrative.
Because one of the other things that I know that we have discussed before is the idea of position, of the narrative position of the story, what the story is going to be, and how that narrative position can shape it. And I promise this is going to link back to exposition. But for instance, a news article. And in a news article, you could take a factual reportage. These are the strict events that happen. But as soon as you try to convert that reportage, that listing of facts, into something that flows, something that has narrative, you tend to narrativize it. And then you are trying to balance the objective terminology or subjective terminology. And if we took, say, for example, an historical event like um, Guy Fawkes trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament. And if we started that report with the traitor Guy Fawkes, the narrative perspective is immediately being centered on the English establishment as that is our narrative perspective, and we are looking at Guy Fawkes as other because we have already called him a traitor.
Mm-hmm.
If we said the freedom fighter Guy Fawkes, we are now shifting the narrative perspective to something on the side of that. And so even in the framing, the position from which you are about to tell this story can absolutely shift and change how your reader is going to perceive those events. And like that is one of the most blatant, obvious, and blunt ways of sort of approaching this, that there is subjective language or judgmental language being applied. And we have this with the steep mountains. And you go, well, that's factual. But steep is not an objective term. Steep is conditional. And if someone grew up on a very flat plain or something like that, then what is steep to them may not be the same as someone who grew up in a huge mountainous region. That they would go, well, actually, no, those aren't particularly steep mountains. You can walk up them. You don't have to climb. And yet, we as reader, when we read these things, we don't realize quite how we are being manipulated by the descriptions because we have a tendency to view exposition as factual without realizing how much of it has actually been narrativized from a perspective. And that perspective may not be the perspective of a character. It could be the perspective of the overall narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and from the writer's point of view, it's the same question, but reframed. How can we, through our language, manipulate the reader? But fortunately, you know, in that respect, maybe not fortunately. Anyways, we're not doing journalism,
yeah,
right? But at the same time, all of the same principles are being applied in your word choice, your diction, and your presumed audience. And I think we have to get to the presumed audience at this point because that is crucial to your word choice, to the slant, the angle at which you want to approach this particular story you're telling. So imagine, I don't think it's been done. It would be great if it was, to do the entire Lord of the Rings, all three books from the orc's point of view, from an orc's point of view. That would be a cool story, right?
you might recall a paper I gave quite some time ago talking about the narrative from the orc's point of view.
Yeah.
Because it radically changes what that story is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same. If you tell the story of Julius Caesar and him expanding the Roman Empire, you go, that's from the position of the Roman Empire. If you tell it from the Gauls,
mm-hmm.
Julius Caesar isn't coming off quite so well in that. It's the encroachment of the Roman Empire into your land.
Right. So
completely reframes it.
Yeah. Yeah. So think of it in these terms. You had the option in fiction. You can write from the Julius Caesar point of view of his expansion into Gaul. Or you can write from the Gaulish point of view, resisting the invaders coming, the Roman invaders. Or you can write from both of those points of view. And when you do that, you create something that sits in the middle for the reader, because the reader is going to be tugged one way and then the other way. But ultimately, everything is coming to almost an objectivized center, because both of these are subjective. And by bringing them together, you create something that potentially is objective. And so where the reader falls is entirely up to the reader.
But
That's kind of the
even
Malazan stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and you do a lot of that in the Malazan
Yeah.
Book of the Fallen. Esselmont does it in the novels of the Malazan Empire as well. The use of multiple perspectives to reframe the entire narrative to let the reader decide. But even in that example that you just gave, if the narrator, even using like talking about the Gaulish perspective, but if that is framed in terms of the Gauls being a savage tribal society,
Hmm.
there's a narrative slant to that that is actually pro-Roman, particularly if
Yes.
the Roman side is then in terms of the civilized Roman Empire, which you would expect in terms of a Roman perspective, thinking of themselves as civilized. But if the narrative itself, even with the Gaulish perspective, is framing the Gauls as savages and these dirty tribes and using all of that sort of quite negative or pejorative or even stereotypical language, that shows you that the entire narrative arc is actually resting on the Roman perspective. So even though you've presented both sides,
Mm.
how you've presented the other side is not actually forwarding their side, but is a
No.
continuation of the
Yeah.
Roman side.
Yeah. And so now added complication to it, where when you write from the Gaulish point of view, you are describing and visualizing the Romans as fascistic. And when you're writing from the Romans' point of view, you're visualizing the Gauls as savage, right? So you can take it one extra level up in terms of the authorial intention here, because you're now placing yet another filter, and it's all about placing filters. So if you have an objective story, like your Guy Fawkes trying to blow up Parliament, that's your objective line, and you're laying these filters on from through the narrative and through the exposition that actually can really leave, as I've discovered, readers very confused as to where they're going to stand in a story. And it's interesting because that was kind of my point, because and Cam and I, we talked about this all the time, because we talk about reading histories, because that's what we did. We read histories. And you could see it. It's all there. And there are multiple levels there, because sometimes those histories, well, most of those histories would have been based on primary texts, but those texts are narrativized.
Mm-hmm.
And then the historian is narrativizing the narrativized text. And so where on earth is the reality of this thing? And that's where the answer comes for us. Anyways, as archaeologists, you go and dig and you find out what's there. So that was always a primary consideration, to think in terms of almost weakening the ground beneath the reader, in terms of what is real and what's relevant. And those are two different things, by the way.
Yeah, and again, that can be very uncomfortable because
Yeah.
we like surety. We like a definitive position because once a definitive position is established, you can side with it or you can argue against it, and
Yeah.
you're on firm ground because there's something solid there. But when you're presented with something that is slightly nebulous or has been removed from that clear distinction of good versus evil, a moral binary, that it becomes, well, these things are happening and this is what these people believe. That that unsurety, that ambiguity, that lack of a solid position to argue for or against becomes quite unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
And either you enjoy that sensation of delving into it, and because that creates a lot of space for interpretation. It
And
allows,
tension. Yeah, it creates tension in the reader. Absolutely. That ambivalence is it's a profound thing, actually. It's a powerful impact on a reader. And you're right, they can like it or not like it.
yeah, and that's why, when we think of that even some of the like highly popular films like the MCU, where you take, oh well, they didn't tell us that, so and so was the hero. They showed him doing a bad thing. You take Iron Man, but the film Iron Man with Robert Downey Jr., who plays Tony Stark as very intelligent, charming, quippy, but he's also narcissistic. He treats people incredibly badly. He is sexist. He is a chauvinist. He doesn't pay attention to the very clear, absolute end point of he makes weapons that kill people. And if he thought about it for a split second or took any duty of care with his company, there's no way that Obadiah Stane would be able to do the things that he did. But because we start with a sympathetic portrayal of Tony, him being injured, and then there's the flashback to him being an ass, we are already predisposed to liking him. And therefore, the entire narrative is framed as Tony as hero. And we view all of his acts in the heroic light. So
Sure,
he
because
executes people.
the injury is the karmic reset, right? It's kind of the really obvious metaphor for turning one's life around is to face that the pain and suffering and the potential recognition of your mortality and all the rest. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of it's kind of a thing.
But what's really weird about it is the narrative is always on Tony's side, even when
Mhm.
showing him do bad things or when he does something that's, not a particularly nice thing, even if it's not bad. The narrative is on his side. The narrative frames him in the best possible light for the vast majority of these things and ultimately will prove him right. And because of that, we are fooled into that position. And it's very
Mhm.
hard to take a step back from what the narrative is trying to tell you about the things to assess what the narrative is actually showing you. Because in that, when characters criticize Tony for being a narcissist or being sexist, it's laughed off. And yet you take a step back and go, yeah, he is. He's a despicable human being in a lot of regards.
Mhm.
And yet we are still meant to forgive him that. The narrative clearly forgives him
Mhm.
for those things. Even though like he is a pretty despicable human being.
Yeah.
But that's the
So
power of
yeah,
narrativizing the events.
yeah, and so then you add the additional filter of point of view, like character point of view, as opposed to authorial point of view.
Mhm.
And so imagine the Roman soldier in the front ranks of this invading army envying the freedom of the Gauls. And then imagine a Gallic soldier in the chaos of the political quagmire that are all the tribes of the Gauls, envying the fascistic order of the Roman Empire. Suddenly, right, everything suddenly the point of view clouds the issue even further.
And again, and even then, the choice of point of view of if you have the point of view on the Roman side from a general's point of view,
Mm-hmm.
and the point of view on the Gallic side from a individual soldier or individual warrior's point of view, the disparity between those different power dynamics, it's giving you a very different view of the world. So again, the manipulation of that, who who is telling the story? Why are they telling the story? From which position is the story being narrated? Who is witnessing this? Whose judgments we're getting? All of these things feed into meaning. It's not just about the event on the page,
No.
but the event on the page is affected by who is perceiving it, who is describing it, why is it being described, how is it being described, and to what effect.
Yeah, let's stay with that Roman general, um, Gallic warrior, because this is where authorial intention can have inadvertent consequences. Although if you're conscious of it, then it works, right? If you're not conscious of it, you may mess up. But a Roman general as a character is reinforcing the notion of a hierarchy of control. So it's cultural, social uh, control of large populations via a tiered, stratified hierarchy. And so his worldview is going to be a hierarchical worldview in terms of viewing humanity and his job and all the rest and his purpose. your average Gallic warrior who's given the option of following his leader or not, because they had that option. If they didn't like the leader, they left. That is almost a stratified particular point of view, but also one in which that Roman structure that's threatening him is actually threatening everything about him in terms of his worldview and his existence. And so you've got a political, socio-cultural subtext to the choice of your characters. And if you're not aware of that, sometimes it can be really weird, right? Because you can end up writing a novel that ends up, pro-fascistic because your hero, your Roman general, is your hero as the writer, or conversely, the warrior is all about bringing it all down. And so, for me at least, to be aware of those things becomes more tools in your toolbox in terms of how you tell your story. Because if you are aware of those things, then you create a character like Karsa Orlan, who wants to bring it all down, because he is the Gallic soldier on the ground there, who's, looking at the organization even of his own people and saying, this is a mess. And then seeing something much more organized and structured and saying that's even more horrifying. And so that's his response, right? So it can give you, the writer a lot of material in which to load onto that character in terms of those kinds of points of view.
But it can also lead to misreading, because in a lot of
Sure.
these things, the surface level information will be from like that general saying, oh, these people are savages. And because that's the surface level information, that's, the first thing that we take in, it colors our understanding. But if we fail to then appreciate the position from which that character is saying it, we can miss the fact that potentially this narrative is actually critical of that position. And I think we see this with Karsa, where Karsa does reprehensible things, and the reader recognizes those as reprehensible. But Karsa doesn't see them as reprehensible. We're talking just at the very beginning within that society. And in fact, the people we see as victims of those acts don't see themselves as victims, because this is part of their society. This is how people are expected to act. They actually view this as, well, yes, this is normal. And that, because that entire framework is focalized through Karsa and that perspective, that is not to say that the narrative arc itself, the narrative position, is going, no, these things are good. It's presenting it to the reader to say, Karsa and his society believes this to be normal and good. You do not have to believe this.
No, and that's, I mean, one of the things that sort of defined my decision to go with the single point of view for Karsa to begin with, book 4, is the notion that the more isolated a society is, the more twisted its sense of normality. And that's what I wanted to expose there and explore. And it's very relevant, and it seems to be becoming more relevant in our own world these days, as particular ideologies through their discourse increasingly self-isolate from the rest of society. And within that context, what is normal becomes very, very twisted indeed. And so, it's just one area to interpret what you're seeing in the Karsa stuff. And if I don't know, taken that opening scene and put it at the end of the novel, as the last part of the novel, as his backstory, I think it would not have worked. for that reason. I wanted the reader to be recoiling in witnessing this particular isolated culture. And then once that's happened, the contact with the external world for one individual within that culture is going to fundamentally change him. So,
And of course, like one of the interesting thing, well, that would actually go into narrative structure elements that we could talk about
yeah,
another
it
thing
would, wouldn't it?
about when you encounter the information and how important
Yeah.
when you encounter that information can be in your interpretation of
It's crucial. It's crucial. Yeah.
but that framing of things as normalized. And while I think it should go without saying, I think I constantly need to say this, which is inclusion does not equal endorsement.
No.
The inclusion of something does not equal endorsement because it can be included, not always, but it can be included to criticize,
Mm.
or it can be included to endorse. A lot of it has to do with context,
Yeah.
and that's part and parcel of why narrative is complex. Because you
Yeah.
could take a scene written by one author, and you could take the same scene, put it in a different book by a different author, and the scene would suddenly radically shift because of the narrative context it is now in, even if it is exactly the same scene word for word. And that's the amazing thing about context. It can radically shift
Yeah.
the scene's meaning. Um, but when we think about that use of framing, because it's not just about the focalization through Karsa, but it's also about the language used in the exposition. Some of it heavily focalized, and some of it not, because we switch to moments when Karsa, there are two breaks in it where it's not Karsa's point of view in that opening sequence. And those scenes are therefore from someone else's point of view. So Karsa's POV is not the focalization. It's the other characters. And that gives you a slightly different perspective of these things. And sometimes I think, particularly in the modern day, where we have become not media illiterate, but less media literate, that we forget that that surface level information still has to be interrogated in line with all of the other aspects. And that means preceding scenes and the following scenes. It means in the general arc of it. It means in what is being done with this character. And that's why, we have these um, different perceptions and interpretations of scenes and characters.
Yeah.
But I think this takes us on to either we can talk about reliability and unreliability and subjectivity within the narrative, or we can talk about the different styles of exposition, talk about transparent prose and all of that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Which do you want to do first?
Yeah, I think we should get back onto the more generalized rather than Carsa specific or
Yeah.
my books or anything like that. So um yeah, what was the second one you mentioned?
The different like purple prose and transparent.
Oh, yeah. So again, that's stylistic elements of exposition,
Yeah.
I guess would be. And at that point, you're then looking at tone as well, and you're looking at diction. Um, and oh man, and you're also looking at pacing, right? Because overly descriptive, or what I guess is generally, I guess purple prose is viewed as overly descriptive, would be indulgent.
Yeah, overly embellished. Usually, uh, in fact, people frequently, if it has lots of big words in it
Yeah.
and lots
So
of
yeah,
Latinate words.
yeah. So that slows pace,
Yeah.
right? And that's one of its primary functions, actually. If you get more, the more descriptive you get, the more you've slowed the pace. And the question then becomes, are you deliberately doing that? Or is it because you've just gotten so caught up in the language and the imagery and the all of that kind of stuff that you've slipped off the rails slightly, and then you got to pull yourself back. And ideally, the what I just described, the latter, is maybe what happens in the first draft of something you write, but should not still be there in the final draft. So it's sometimes you have to allow your love of language to show up on the page, and then there are times when you want to pare it right back, because they each have their own effect, and it's whether you're conscious of those effects and whether those effects are actually in service to what it is you're trying to do in the story is the deciding factor, whether it stays or goes.
And I think that that's a very important point, which is in service of the narrative.
Yeah.
And that does not mean in service of the narrative event. It
Or the
doesn't,
plot, or the
or the
plot.
plot or the
Yeah.
story. It's in service of the entire construct of narrative. So if you have a very character focused narrative, it can be in service of building out that character, not about advancing a plot point, not about advancing a narrative event. And I think sometimes we conflate. We go, was this necessary for the telling of this event? And you go, why are you hyper focused on the event?
Yeah,
That's not the
novel
be
as
all and end all of
yeah,
every narrative.
yeah, novel as point forward. Yeah. Get to the points. Get to the points.
You know,
Yeah.
what's the bullet point summary of what
Yeah.
happened? And you go, it's not always about what happened, the why it happened, how it happened, who it happened to. These are all quite often equally, if not more important points than the what.
Yeah.
And it again, it will depend on the specific narrative. It will depend on the specific genre. And we were talking a bit about intended audience. Intended audience is so crucial for aspects of this because it's not just about a way to create a verisimilitudinous reality on the page. In order to do that, you have to know what the expectations of your audience are, or at least be trying to imagine that. Because if I'm trying to deliver a paper on a particular point about narratology to an audience of narratologists, I will get to the point very quickly and I will use a lot of very dense terminology that is hyper specific to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah. You'll up your diction level. Yeah.
But if I was to deliver that same thing as a YouTube video for general consumption, using that terminology, as I have found out in previous videos, tends to lose people because they're not as familiar with it. And so therefore I have to remember to use more commonplace words to be more embracing and encompassing of an inclusive audience, not an exclusive audience. And that's not about dumbing down what I'm talking about. It's about trying to find a common language to communicate. And writing for children, writing for young adult, writing for adult, those are considerations. Writing for a North American audience or a Western audience, those are considerations. Are they the most important? Maybe not, but they are considerations.
Yeah. And then one also needs to, I think, bear in mind that if you're tying your exposition to particular points of view, that is the opportunity to alter style of your exposition. So you have a dreamy, poetic character. Chances are they may, slip into purple prose when they're internalizing everything they're seeing around them. They may be kind of languid and wandering and all the rest. And if your prose reflects that, then that is a very close and loyal adherence to that point of view.
And
then you can switch it around completely with the next character.
And this is the interesting thing about focalization, because if someone then said, "Oh, but that character, all of that stuff should be trimmed away. It's purple prose. It's too much." And you go, "But the point of view character is that this is the most efficient way to get across their reality." And if you turned it into, "Oh, this character is dreamy," you've shifted perspective to outside that character to now labeling them with a description, and you're now telling the reader what this character is without showing the reader and letting the reader experience what the character is. And that's the tension that we have between the sort of the show side of writing and the tell side of writing, both of which obviously are used in almost every single narrative. It moves.
Yeah. And of course, then you step back one level and you got the overall narration and narrator of the exposition. And what is their stance towards that poetic character? And what is their stance towards this character, that character, whatever? And how much of that is actually skewing what we are getting? Because that's sort of the primary filter. That's the last filter, is the narrator. And so, you know, it's a famous poem. I think it's called My Last Duchess. You know that poem? Yeah.
Not off by heart, but
Yeah. Well, there, the narrator's voice is excruciatingly contemptuous of everything that's going on in the poem. And if you don't get that, you don't get the poem. All right. So you need to actually analyze it and think about it enough and take it apart enough to understand there is an overlay of a tonal dissonance that's part of the purpose of telling that poem and writing that poem in the way that it was.
And you have the same thing with A Modest Proposal by Swift.
Yeah.
That, you know, it has all of the appearances of being very earnest and heartfelt. Here's a solution that I have found, and yet we know it is directly critical, not only suggesting that it's entirely monstrous and you should never do that, but also critical of the position of what the authorities are doing in relation to Ireland at that time, and how they are dismissive of the Irish and how they don't care. That it's a critique of them. And, you know, some of that.
Yeah, wasn't there something recently, somebody reading it as if it were an actual proposal? The levels of credulity these days.
Well, to be perfectly honest, in the modern day, I have seen people teach this. I have heard from people who teach this to first-year undergraduates, and sometimes the first-year undergraduates don't understand that this is not a serious proposal, and they are shocked. How dare Swift suggest that, you know, the Irish eat their babies, and they completely misread the entire thing.
And that's the other issue, right? Is that there are cultural cues that will be in a text that maybe end up through time becoming too culture specific and specific in and of their time. And maybe as satire and irony slowly wend their way into extinction within our world, these things actually are much more vulnerable to being misread and misunderstood.
But, you know, to illustrate this, I think we could start with a position of, if you take one of the most simplified forms where you almost have a conflation of a lot of these things to make it a very simple example. If you have a first person past tense point of view, as that's what the narrative is, first person past tense. So it is someone, we are viewing it through their eyes. This is what happens. This is how they understand it. And it is being recounted to the reader. And then you can move and complicate that and go, right, well, what if it's the memoir of that first person perspective? Because now the narrative we know has been reframed, that this person is looking back on it and they have decided to write it in a certain way. And that person at the end is not the same as the person going through these things. And suddenly it's added this level of complication where the narrator is not the same as the character. And then you can have a further complication, which is, if we think of that as a model, and then you add in other chunks from a different first person, and you go, that's where we're getting multiple POVs, and you switch them then to third person. And then you can have the narrator who has compiled this kind of done so for various reasons. The sequence of when you get one point of view and when you move to the next one, that juxtaposition or that complementary pairing, that those things add to the level of complexity and nuance that you can extract from a text. And we see this in the formation of anthologies of short stories, where there are brilliant short story editors who, when they put the collection together, the reason they are organized that way is that there's usually these different levels of continuity running through the stories. And sometimes it's to juxtapose, and sometimes it's to support. And actually, how they are organized is part of, even if these stories are written by different authors. And if you move those short stories around, you would actually change the feeling and composition of the collection. And we very rarely think about that as a consumer of it. But that actually does affect our understanding of the collection as a whole.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we have left most of our audience behind on this one. Maybe we should go back to what Exposition does with all that kind of stuff, tone, perspective, stripped away. So Exposition as that which sits and encompasses, but does not include dialogue, is basically your prose. So Exposition carries with it all of those elements that are world building, if you will, and character building, because exposition often is interspersed with dialogue to support the dialogue and to add physical action and physical presence for the speakers. So that's kind of at the most basic definition of exposition, which we got to, like, 40 minutes into this.
We might recut this to move that earlier on.
No, let's not.
But exposition, in some respects, while it is not a one-to-one, one of the ways of thinking about exposition is it is description. But it is description of the world, of the landscape, of the characters, of the action. Exposition, at its heart, I think, is description of some kind. And that's, again, there are exceptions, because where are we placing internal monologue? But that's a further complication we can deal with later. But description, thinking of exposition as description is a good, I think, general way to think about it.
Yeah. So then you've broken down things like character, actions, setting would be, I guess, two of the main ones, plus the driving of the plot. And then maybe, if you want to get a bit more complicated, exploration of theme. So if you take each of these, and let's take setting to begin with. Okay, so you've got exposition that's providing, laying out the setting for your characters and your story. As a writer, yes, you can just write it as flat out factual descriptions of a landscape or an environment or a room or whatever. But it's worthwhile as a writer to recognize that how you describe that is actually going to affect the reader in different ways. The choices, your word choices, even the poetic elements of your sentence structures are all going to convey something of tone and atmosphere in that setting. So it's no longer just setting now, it's also providing a kind of an emotional backdrop that is going to support what's coming. And what's coming would be exposition involving a character. And so where you place that character in that setting, what is that character's emotional state? And is that emotional state being supported by the physical description of their environment, or is it being juxtaposed? Which both, I mean, as long as you're conscious of what you're up to, these things will do these jobs for you, in a sense.
And I think, like, a nice, simple, basic example of this is, okay, so let's say the setting is jungle. Now, is the jungle being framed as alien and frightening and unknowable and full of strange and weird, monstrous things that are going to prey on you. Because obviously, then the framing of jungle then is of a hostile environment.
Yeah.
And as soon as that's in your head, you're writing from and describing from a very particular perspective. But if you're writing from the, well, no, jungle is home, jungle is normal, jungle is supportive, jungle is where we're getting this food from, this is the safety of the jungle. That is writing it from a very different perspective. And suddenly you can see describing the same jungle clearing, depending on how you describe it, is going to alter how it is perceived, the feeling, the atmosphere that is being evoked, the way that a reader is going to feel about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I mean, a good example would be conquistador in a jungle. That particular point of view versus an indigenous person, looking out through the shadows at that conquistador. The descriptive terminology you're going to use, even the rhythms you're going to use in your sentences will be tied into those specific points of view. So now we're moving into a whole area of sentence structure and rhythm to convey emotional effect. So if you were to write the conquistador hacking his way through the jungle, then if you write it in dissonant, discordant, even sort of structurally halting kind of sentence structure and language, then that reflects his war with that environment. And then if you go to the indigenous person who's tracking him, then you can change your language and your sentence structure to create a kind of dreamlike flow as that person moves through the jungle, because it is their environment, it's their home, they're familiar with it. And all of these things have an effect on your word choice and your sentence structure. And so what can be really frustrating is some reviewer coming on and say, well, that's a bad sentence, or that's, the style changes here, and it's like the guy's all over the place. Well, it's because you're tying your language and your diction into your points of view as seamlessly as possible for an effect.
Yeah. And then, we can then take that example, because what you've done there is focalize the perspective very much through those characters. But if you take a step back from that and go, no, I'm going to use a slightly different style and be objective about it. And, this is quite often where people say, oh, it's an omniscient point of view. It's not necessarily an omniscient point of view, but you can move back and try to be more objective. But you're still going to have a description of things. And so if the conquistador character and those passages are not being focalized through him, but are being viewed as very much, this is a struggle through this dangerous place. And then you switch to, again, with an objective sort of looking down on things. So you're not trying to focalize through that. But you can't use that same tone and approach to the inhabitant who is tracking them, because you're not going to create the same effect. You're not going to create the same feel to it, the same atmosphere. Because where the conquistador is going to be loud and aggressive and hacking and it's very aggressive, cacophonous, and you would expect a lot of quite harsh, violent language in those descriptions. If someone is being stealthy, you wouldn't use that same language, even if you're not focalizing it through their point of view. If you're simply describing it, you soften the language, you make the language more silent, because that is more evocative of the scene, even if it is not being tightly focalized through the point of view.
Yeah, and you could do things like the conquistador, if you're imagining him, using his sword, basically cut his way through this jungle, short sentences, not just the hard consonants, but short sentences, because it's a plotting battle for every step that he takes. For the other character, long sentences, flowing, watery like sentences that just slide through this jungle. And so you've altered sentence length and sentence patterns at the same time. And again, all of this stuff in terms of exposition, just like dialogue, is for effect. And as long as the writer is conscious of the effect that they are creating in their exposition, then it's liberating as a writer, because then you know you've got this stuff that you can work with.
And the thing is, it's not that you have to do it this way.
No.
But knowing about those effects, knowing what you can achieve and how to achieve it, and even for me, knowing as a reader how this is being achieved, it's something that you relax into, and you're not suddenly struck by, but the sentences have suddenly changed here. You actually just relax into it because you're aware of it as a technique. And so what I love about all of these different approaches to exposition, to description, to sentence length, and the diction, the lexical selection within sentences, being aware of all of those things shows you how many tools are at the disposal of an author, and therefore what they choose to do with it it's amazing, and it's almost infinite in its complexity.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Almost the best measure of success is when the reader doesn't notice all the things you've done. Yeah.
And that's when you relax into it and it doesn't catch your eye, but you just feel it. And of course, like, the downside to knowing more about these things is it's a bit like if you know how a magic trick is done. You can still appreciate the artistry of it, but you know how the trick is done. It loses an element of the magic. I freely admit that.
Yeah, but also when it doesn't, when the writer's messed up and it doesn't work, you notice it, right? And anybody can notice that.
Yeah, but also sometimes when there is a mistake like that or an issue like that, because you notice it, because you notice why the mistake happened or how it happened, you can sometimes be a lot more forgiving of it. Because you go, I can see what they were trying to do and it didn't work. But I can see what they were trying to do, so I know what they were trying to do and I can just move on, as opposed to there's something wrong with this.
Yes, but I can't figure out what it is, and so I hate the whole thing.
And it's a bit like when we've discussed in the past, like pacing, which is clearly a very strong element that we find in exposition. The control of pacing is done predominantly through exposition and how it is intercut with dialogue. And exposition, description, is quite often far more significant in controlling pacing than dialogue. But it is in the interaction of the two, I think, you get the strongest elements of it. But,
well, I mean, if you want to stop pacing, have somebody give a speech, or have somebody have a long passage of internal monologue that doesn't interact in any way with the physical setting. Yeah, your pacing just drops her off. But as long as you're aware of that, there are times for that. There's times when that is crucial to your story.
and again, one of the things that I think, and it depends, again, I have to keep coming back to saying out loud, it will depend on the individual narrative. That this is not a hard and fast rule, but sometimes when you have a big event happen, it is almost necessary that the next scene is slow, because the reader needs time to fully absorb what happened, the implications of what has happened. And how an author achieves that, there are a number of different ways, one of which is have basically characters who have just been involved in a big action set piece or a big battle or something like that, suddenly now sit down and they discuss the ramifications of what just happened and go over the thing. And you go, that's a very straightforward, and if you can forgive the pejorative here, because I don't mean it quite as pejorative, but bold way of doing it. You have the action and then you have people talk about it. And that gives you have the big, fast flowing, lots of things happening, and then the respite to let your heart rate come back down, to let things sink in, to appreciate what happened. And if an author has commentary on it, it makes it even easier because they're essentially telling you. Another way.
Yeah, I know. I have an instinctive aversion for that. I mean, I absolutely adore writing the scenes after major action because yes, the reader needs to take that break, but the reader also needs to absorb what has just happened. And if I show characters who have been emotionally destroyed by what has happened, that to me, that is more effective than to have them sit there discussing things in a clinical fashion. Because then that tells you they're not affected by what just happened at all, which doesn't make sense for me. So,
But this is why it is so common, like even in action movies, where you know
of
that
course.
there's a big battle sequence and the hero's doing things, and then suddenly they duck behind cover, and then the two of them are sitting having a conversation about what is going on because you can't keep the tension ratcheted up all the way through. You have to have those
Oh,
moments of
wait a
relief.
minute, wait a minute. I've watched all the seasons of Star Trek Discovery. Apparently, you can. You can have entire speeches between two characters while the ship's about to blow up. So come on.
And again, it comes down to balance. It comes
Yeah.
down to how it is being done and worked in. And we are forgiving to a certain point of something that is unrealistic in an action sequence. Because like, we have that, like in any of the big superhero movies, where they're in the middle of a fight, and then suddenly there's I'm going to have a conversation here, and then they go back to the fight. And quite
Even the
often,
gunshots all drop off. Yeah, everything gets
and
quiet.
and quite often, it is completely and utterly unrealistic. But because the effect is it gives us that momentary respite, we are willing to forgive it. But if it is handled in a way that is perhaps too obvious or is not more integrated into the scene, that's when we can feel, oh God, this is so artificial and they're not paying attention to what's going on. And it's again, it's always a balance between those tensions, a balance between creating a verisimilitudinous reality, an authentic reality,
Yeah.
and what is important for narrative, which is highly artificial. That there has to be a balance between those two things. And if it errs further one way than the other, that's quite often when we run into issues. But again, part of that is going to be dependent on the type of narrative, dependent on the feel of the narrative that is being created. Is it meant to be more verisimilitudinous? Or is it meant to be more aware of its nature as story?
Mm.
And
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, a great example of this is not in novels at all. It's in, I would suggest the last 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan is an extraordinary exploration and so deftly handled of that shifting of pace and the closing of psychic distance and the pulling back of psychic distance, and then the aftermath and the absolute utterly destroyed character who survives. Um, it is, for a writer, just because it's film doesn't mean you can't learn a lot from it. And just pick that up and watch those last 20 minutes. It's it's extraordinary.
And in fact, you can see a lot of it in the opening beach
Yes.
landing scene because you have that the tension building up as they get closer. And then as they go, suddenly there are bullets flying everywhere. It's frenetic on the screen. And then an explosion goes off and there's that tinnitus sound as everything goes quiet apart from the tinnitus. And then there's looking about dazed and it slows everything down.
Yeah. And
Then
it happens again. The sound drops off towards the end as well, which is, believe it or not, you can it I don't know. You don't necessarily, you can't write that into a fictional work, right? The sound drops off. But you can write it as if for you, the writer, the sound has dropped off. When I got to the final scenes of Deadhouse Gates, from the moment the army appears, um, I dropped the sound in my head. And so I wrote everything as if there was no sound at all until Squint is called up.
yeah.
And it has, it's an interesting tool to use. Is when you're watching film, pay attention to sort of what they're doing with lighting, what they're doing with sound, especially, and use that in the creative process of your fiction. Like I say, you cannot convey the dropping off of sound unless you got a character who's got ringing in the ears, but that doesn't work. but in the actual creative process, you can use successful filmic techniques in affecting how you are going to describe in your exposition what is happening.
But to return to Saving Private Ryan for a minute, that beach scene, because that's not the only time that they use that dip in action, because then it speeds back up again and there's stuff going on and it's highly frenetic. And then we have the moment when they're all lying up against the dune and looking up, and there's a respite. So even though it is all one continuous action scene, in it you have these moments of high action and tension, a drop down of everything is slowed down and it is a different feeling being evoked, to picking back up to the frenetic action, to then another drop down as they have a conversation about what they're going to do next and they're not in the midst of it. And you can see that altering of pace, altering of style, altering of tone and atmosphere. And it's done through not only dialogue, the type of camera movement, the soundscape that's being created, all of those things. And that's the language of cinema. But when we have it in fiction writing, you can have, as you know, we've talked about before, an action sequence where you have lots of shorter words and short sentences that are very, very rapid because your eye goes along them very, very quickly. And that gives a rapid sense of pace. Or you can have a lot of things happening within one sentence and you suddenly realize the encapsulation of a lot of actions in a single sentence gives you a sense of a lot of things happening. And then long drawn out sentences or longer paragraphs, or as you said, with a speech, suddenly you're arrested, you're stopped, you're slowed down. And these are the different techniques using actual structure, the type of words, the size of words, the length of sentences, the number of sentences, all to create effect. And when people talk about transparent prose and purple prose and use these things, I think sometimes that those particular stylistic choices are being viewed in an isolation, which is ignoring how they interact with all of the other elements which are necessary to understand them. That transparent prose in and of itself, is never as transparent as people think it is, because quite often there is a narrative perspective that is being linked to it. And as soon as you have a narrative perspective, you have a lens, you have a filter. And that changes it. And therefore it is not transparent anymore, but it may be translucent. And even then, the shape of the narrative, what is being told and how it is being told, even if they are using a very transparent style, can actually be very forced in one direction. It can be very transparent in the direction that they want you to interpret it, or it can be left more ambiguous. And I think when people use the term transparent prose, they forget that narrative perspective, style of narration, narrative point of view, the character perspective and position, all of these things are incredibly important to evaluating. That aiming for transparency in prose is all well and good, but you have to do it in consideration of all of these other things. Because like Hemingway was very, very good at using what appeared to be very transparent prose to pack in incredible amounts of subtext and information. And you wouldn't refer to his prose as purple prose or flowery prose or poetic, but what is being conveyed in that style is incredible density of information.
And then contrast that with Faulkner, right? So
long languid sentences in Faulkner. And again, a lot of that was to convey something of the world, of the character position, of the feel or the environment. But
it's the South, right? So it's cloying and it's sticky and it's all
humid.
Humid.
Languorous.
Yeah.
If we want to use slightly, less pejorative words than sticky.
Oh, I like sticky. Anyways, I was going to say, oh, here's a tip. People writing fantasy, military fantasy. Presumably, most people who are writing that have already done this, but get a hold of every single war film ever produced and watch them, because that will really, really help when you are writing your huge battle scenes, because the best ones will always shift focus from large scale to small scale, and handle them very deftly so that they support one another. I mean, in that final scene in Saving Private Ryan, there's one scene that happens in a building between two people with a knife, with a bayonet, and the tension level is just it skyrockets at that point, and yet there's almost no movement on the screen whatsoever, because it's two people in a clinch, and that's just, I mean, it's so artfully done, it's so well done, that as a writer you need to take notes on that stuff, mental notes on that stuff. This is good stuff. The Longest Day would be another great example of how to write a major military engagement, and take it from start to finish.
And again, a lot of it has to do with, people go, oh, a brilliant action scene. And you go, but sometimes it's how the tension building up to it, to an explosive release. You need the tension to achieve the effect. And yeah, you could reduce the amount of tension you build in, but that is going to reduce your effect a lot of the time. If you extend the tension too far, the reader might give up before they get to the release. Again, it's always going to come down to a question that the author has to decide what is enough for the thing that they want. And one of the great sequences that you see in terms of film about this, if you think of the submarine movies, when they build up the tension of the encounter, like these are not the dog fights in the air with lots of things exploding. It's the huge buildup of tension. And quite often you see it starts with these sort of mid-range camera shots where you're seeing like different people. And then as the tension wraps up, quite often you get closer and closer and closer shots of the people, the beads of sweat forming. And now you're so close to them, you can see them trickle down. And getting closer and closer to their eyes, and it's cutting between people to show you this tension. Then it cuts to the outside, and it's this all of that tension ramping up until suddenly there will be the torpedo in the water and action, and people are suddenly moving around, and next thing you know, you're back out watching the action. And all of that is about very tight control of what is being described, and in cinema terms, how they're showing it to you. But for a exposition, what you are choosing to focus on.
Das Boot would be a good example for people to watch.
Das Boot, Crimson Tide, The Hunt for Red October.
The Hunt for Red October is pretty good.
Yeah, it all depends on what film you want to sit through. But Das Boot, certain. But like all of these things, the choice in what to describe actually is a big thing about exposition. You can say, oh, I want to describe this action sequence. But if in your description you're talking about how a warrior is suddenly their grip tightening on the hilt of the weapon and the trickle of sweat, you've slowed everything down, and you're now focusing on those elements that are that imagined close-up, the building up of tension, the sudden whitening of their knuckles, that all of that can be used. Or you go, they drew their sword. It's
the same thing as huge armies clashing, and 10,000 died there and 8,000 died there. I mean, it depends on what the author is actually interested in. If they just want to get past the battle scene, fine, do it that way. To get to what is for them more interesting, which would be the aftermath, the characters, etc., etc.
Right. Well, we've covered quite a lot about exposition. I'm sure there'll be questions or comments on this, and maybe we can at some point come back and discuss if anyone has specific questions.
Certainly, but also everything we're going to discuss following this is all related to exposition. So We'll just be elaborating on exposition. We'll deal with things like psychic distance and go back to sentence pattern, rhythm, structure, diction levels, etc.
And that's the thing. It's like no matter how many times I tell people, they are all
Oh.
interrelated. We still have this need in order to create sort of bite-sized chunks that we go, okay, we're going to look at this thing in isolation. And you go, it's all well and good to look at it in isolation, as long as you remember it has to go back and fit with everything else, that everything, how we talked about dialogue, how we talked about narrative perspective, how we talked about vocalization, how we talk, they are all part and parcel of the same thing. But a 12-hour video would be ridiculous for the two of us to record. We'd be exhausted. And also, no one can sit through that amount all in one go.
Yeah, no, this is like all the tools for the writer's toolbox as well. So, and you know, they can reshape those tools as it suits them. There's nothing hard and fast in this stuff. This is simply it's that element of continuity that has followed storytelling and has now been codified in our books.
Yeah,
to some extent.
And even like we didn't even deal with the distinction between something that is written to be read aloud and performed, and something that maybe the author is not intending that. Like that's the performance and style of narration in that sense is actually can be quite different, because depending on the style, whether it is intended to be heard or intended to be read in a certain way, those things can radically alter the words on the page. And we haven't even gotten to that yet.
Yeah. And a lot of authors will actually write a narrative ostensibly as a book, but with the intention of it being read. Or
adapted into a TV show, which is increasingly common now, apparently. With
increasingly common. I would say The Expanse would be a good example of that. I think it was very much targeted to be adapted. And successfully so.
And that is not necessarily a bad thing.
No. I love The Expanse.
But again, I think sometimes people think because we talk about literature so much that we poo-poo the idea of these different forms. Like, yeah, we have preferences about what we like, which is like everyone does. But I hope that we get across that we're not saying you must do it this way.
No, not at all.
But Steve, thank you very much for taking this time.
And it was free.
And it was free. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, especially those who have donated to the Ko-Fi button and bought me a coffee. Wink. Thank you very much, and we will see you in the next one.